A formal condemnation of anti-Semitism touched off a furious debate between old House Democrats, the Centrists, and their young liberal colleagues. The point of contention being over whether the Representative Ilhan Omar is being singled out for unfair treatment over her statements on Israel and politicians across the aisle from both Democratic and Republican parties and their sentiments towards the Jewish state. The resolution that was to be voted upon grew out of Omar's suggestion last week that pro-Israel activists were tainted with allegiance to a foreign country. That remark infuriated leading Jewish members of the House who said that this was playing into an old anti-Semitic trope of double loyalty, and they accused Ilhan Omar of inciting anti-Semitism. And of course, this comes just a few weeks after Ilhan Omar had already apologized for tweeting another infuriating tweet, saying that support for Israel was all about the Benjamins. Of course, that she's referencing to the $100 bill, saying that support for Israel was being funded by money. In plain words, bribes to US politicians. And of course, that's another anti-Semitic trope. And of course, it speaks about the influence of AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, a lobby group that advocates Israel's interests. But if we pause for a moment and consider what this debate had been going about, of course, this comes from an inexperienced freshman congresswoman. But if we look for any anti-Semitic motive that's hazardous to the US public, we won't likely to find any. Because if that was true, who would be at stake of being incited into anti-Semitism? Right now, in the current US political and social landscape, the most vulnerable and most perceptive of this message would be white supremacists. So, are white supremacists going to be inspired by comments of a black, Muslim, veiled woman? It's no on all fronts, being a woman, black, Muslim, veiled. And if we dismiss the real danger of anti-Semitism, that being committed by white supremacists, it would be ridiculous to think that her comments could be an inspiration for American Muslims, who are a very small minority. And it's of course over this disproportionate reaction to Omar's comment that progressives in the House, progressive Democrats, and their allies have been rallying to the defense of Omar, the representative from Minnesota. And of course, one of two women, first two Muslim women, to be elected in the Congress. Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who is of course ideologically allied with the centrists, but so far has been treating the matter quite delicately, suggested that the resolution would also include language condemning anti-Muslim bias, a move that had been advocated by the Congressional Progressive Caucus. But of course, since that's not the message of condemnation that was proposed, the whole resolution has been postponed. And an ongoing rift is now emerging around Ilhan Omar, and it could be, seriously, one of the most consequential rifts within the Democratic Party. Its ideological and generational divide that's been growing fierce in the past few days. It's even threatening to derail the party's legislative agenda, which is of course exhaustive and aims to overturn a number of Trump's efforts during the past 2 years. On the side of the centrist Democrats are veterans like Eliot Engel, Nita Lewis, and Gerald Nadler, all of whom lead major House committees and are Jewish. And they have had some talks with Steny Hoyer, the majority leader, and they have been pushing for a response against Omar. On the other side, the progressives include the likes of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, representative of New York, on liberal groups like Justice Democrats, If Not Now, which is a movement of young Jews dedicated to ending the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. These group of progressive activists accuse the centrist Democrats of singling out a woman of color while letting comments from Republicans that are way more racist and anti-Semitic and bigoted, even ones from their arch nemesis, which is, of course, Donald Trump. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez gave one example when she mentioned how one of the Republican representatives told her on the floor of the Congress to go back to Puerto Rico, and there was no backlash to his comment. The progressives in the Progressive Change Campaign Committee, which is a liberal advocacy group, said that they had begun raising money for Democrats who support Ilhan Omar, and they will work against the veteran Democrats, the Old League, people like Mr. Engel and Lowy, calling their criticism shameful because they see Ilhan Omar's criticism of Israel has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. Jeremy Scahill, who founded a website called The Intercept, a left-wing news organization, wrote on Twitter,
"The Democratic Party's throwing of Ilhan Omar under the bus is, unfortunately and unsurprisingly, a disgrace. She raised an entirely legitimate concern about U.S. support for the murderous apartheid government of Israel and the subservience of U.S. politicians to the agenda of a foreign power."
Of course, most concerning for the centrist Democrats and politicians sympathetic to Israel is that Ilhan Omar serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, which of course oversees the Middle East policy. And of course, Mrs. Omar's blatant stand puts the centrist Democrats in a fix because they had already been facing calls from supporters of Israel to strip her of the seat on the Foreign Affairs Committee, which of course Mr. Engel, who is supportive of Israel, is the head of that committee. Even congressional allies of Ilhan Omar admit that she is in an impossible situation because every word she utters is heavily scrutinized, and that is in stark contrast with a lot of bigoted commentary uttered by many Republicans and Trump himself, whose remarks are passed over without consequence. But we have to discuss the following point. Is Ilhan Omar criticism legitimate? Is Israeli influence over United States politicians that much of a concern? Is AIPAC too powerful? For that, let's make this mind experimentation. Let's formulate a few questions. Why does the United States support the state of Israel? Is it for moralistic grounds and humanistic as well, or is it for strategic and logistical ones? If we claim the first one, that the United States supports Israel for moralistic and humanistic grounds, then why doesn't the US intervene when China puts the Uyghur Muslims in Gulag camps in China? But let's forget about that. China is too big. The US wouldn't antagonize the megastate to that extent, discussing sensitive internal politics. Okay, forget about China and her Muslims. So what about Kingdom of Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia has a substantial Shia Muslims in the east who are religiously prosecuted. They can't have their mosques. They can't have any freedom of voice. Why doesn't the United States stand for those minorities? The response will come, the Saudi Arabia is too important of an ally for the United States in the region, and the United States wouldn't stand the splint or weakening of the Saudi Arabia for the advantage of Iran. Okay, fair enough. Then what about the Muslims of Myanmar? The United Nations issued a report, I don't remember the last year or the one before, considering the prosecution of Myanmar Muslims as a genocide, that the government of Myanmar was committing a genocide against its Muslims. Of course, the United States condemned, but there was no intervention at all. What about the Kurds with Turkey? What has the United States done for them? Of course, there are sympathetic comments by Trump and before him from Obama, but did the United States interfere, help them in any meaningful way. So the United States' support for Israel in the region couldn't simply be on moralistic and humanistic grounds. Then the argument may go to the other side of the argument, forget about the morals and forget about humanistic values. United States as a country has responsibilities and interests in each and every region of the world, and it won't squander them in support of any particular state or groups of people. United States supports Israel because it's in the interests of the United States to support such country. And then the question arises, what's that interest? On what grounds does the US interests become served by helping Israel? In the Middle East, all countries except for Syria and Iran, the United States has military bases in almost each country. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, Iraq, you name it. The United States has military bases in each one of them. All these Arab Gulf states, even Jordan and Egypt, are almost satellite states to the United States. They cannot and would never dare cross the United States. So why does the United States need Israel? The political governing bodies in each country of the region is allied to the United States. This has been since the 70s at least. So it's quite clear that from the sovereignty point of view and from the interests point of view, Israel shouldn't be having that particular influence in the United States strategy. The United States politicians shouldn't be harboring that intense emotion for Israel. And yet it has. And why may the reason arise? Comes, of course, the rhetoric stirred by Ilhan Omar, by her brash, unsophisticated tweets that has everything to do with it. That's exactly the reason behind that incredible backlash. AIPAC's magic trick, which already many had known, was now in the open and could be frankly and openly discussed. Not only all politicians from both sides of the aisle are tainted by the revelation, more importantly, money coming from AIPAC associates is increasingly being seen as dirty money. And the problem will be now that conscientious, idealistic politicians would think twice before accepting money from AIPAC.